So this issue has been on my mind recently, about how to manage excesses and extremes that erupt in our society, and there are many of them at present, especially on the part of the left. I think that the emergence of conservative movements in the way that we're seeing, and also the withdrawal of many young people from the ranks of the left, is indicative of the extremism in which leftist politics have gone. And of course there are too many indications of this. It's not an issue to contest. But what's interesting for me is the emergence of conservatism and of right-wing politics as a means, as a response, as a reaction to this leftist extremism. And I've been contemplating this a lot because it's not usual for conservative people to become so loud, to be so outspoken and active in public matters and public life and in politics. And the fact that this is the case is quite colossal. Really, it means a lot, because the temperament, the natural temperament of conservative people is that they take care of themselves, they take care of their families, they are not so much into activism and form of public engagement, political engagement. It's not particularly common among conservative temperaments. Many of them have religious sentiments, and instead of involving themselves and spending their time pursuing political ends, they have more interest in religious matters. Not every last one of them, of course, but it's far more prevalent among them than it is among leftists, of course. So the fact that conservative and right-wing movements have come to the fore so much recently, and the also the results of the elections in Italy, and the fact that the majority of populations now, however much by a small margin, but they're beginning to vote for right-wing, even far right-wing political figures, as well as in the case in the United States as well, of course, with Trump and all. All this is highly relevant and informative about something that's happening in society. And I think that this is pretty much healthy and natural and necessary, because if this doesn't happen, the left will just take off. And it's already taken off. I mean, it's already doing crazy things, starting from inculcating children about gender and sex and so on, and all the way to reparations and judging people, judging entire races by their past, by their old past, as well as actually offering insane interpretations about that very past itself. Like, colonialism was only a natural thing to do at the time. Slavery was a natural thing. These were normal things. There was nothing excessive about them by the standards of the time. And what we're seeing, of course, is this sort of anachronistic reading of history, as if things of the past, where infanticide, for example, was a universal phenomenon. Everybody practiced infanticide in ancient times. If we're going to judge people by their past, then everybody will be, one way or another, a criminal. Every race will be. Not one will be spared. And even when we look at historical phenomena such as slavery, for example, actually the West was the foremost, the first in moving away from it. It was among the first to outlaw infanticide. It was among the first to enforce the rule of law and the equality of all before the law. So even if we judge by these standards and follow these insane ways of looking at history and connecting it to the present that leftists are currently doing in the name of equity and so on, the white man and the white race will actually prove to be better than most other races. And of course, slavery persists to this day in certain parts of Africa and so on and so forth. So it's gone crazy. It's gone completely insane. And now, in the name of equity, they practice racism themselves and sexism as well. As we all know, the feminist movements have become a movement of demeaning, oppressing, and marginalizing men. And this is not something that is like a project or an ambitious political aim that they're pursuing. It's a reality. Men of most Western societies today have become so timid, so hesitant, so withdrawn, and women are making as much money or more money than men do. They go into universities and college programs and receive scholarships way more than men. And so the situation, of course, is quite catastrophic at present in terms of the well-being of society. So what was on my mind is this necessary emergence of the right and of the conservative movements as a balancing act. And this must happen because even in nature, we never see any extreme event, natural, biological extreme event happening that is not immediately and by natural forces balanced, either by other natural forces or from within itself. For example, when a population of a certain species grows so much, eventually it stops all of a sudden. And this growth, if it keeps going, then there will be some sort of environmental or the biospheric form of catastrophe. But the population growth, which is observed in nature in certain species, eventually come to stop, and you wonder what makes it stop. Why does it stop? Why does it not go to farther extremes and more extremes? And this is very strange. And of course, there are so many more examples of this in nature, like countless examples. And you see, for example, the earthquakes, volcanoes, etc. These are things that are of extreme nature, and when they explode, when a volcano explodes or when earthquakes occur, their occurrence is not very frequent. And when it happens, it's a vast expanse of time, a long expanse of time that separates the reoccurrence of these events. So this sort of balance that exists in nature is worth contemplating, and particularly the question, what makes it happen? What's the force that balances nature in this way so that extreme things do happen, but they're immediately balanced naturally? And I think that this is reflecting itself. This transcendental sort of cosmological force is also operant in societal affairs. And it's really clear in my mind now that the left is constantly something that's always pushing towards extremes. And this has been the case ever since the beginning of history, ever since we have politics more or less in the modern sense of the word, always pushing to extremes, because it is always seeking this situation of perfection. That's what most leftists are seeking, is perfection. They want to bring the societal conditions into perfect state of equality, perfect state of lack of or absence of mistakes. They want to create utopia on earth in this way or that. Of course, which is impossible from a practical point of view and also a philosophical one. And that's one of the main things that really distinguish conservatives from leftists, that conservatives are far more willing to accept reality as it is, and to recognize that something's always going to go wrong, some form of inequality, some form of imperfection exists as if intrinsically in our human existence. The idea is that if God couldn't do it, but probably didn't want to do it, if this whole creation naturally involves all these mishaps, all these inequalities, harm, pain, suffering, then it's there for a reason. And this is often something that the leftist intellectuals raise against the argument of God. That if there was a benevolent God, then why is reality so ridden with pain and suffering and hurt and so on? But of course, the answer is that this is how it was planned to be. This is not a mistake, not a mishap. This is precisely what human needs in order to grow, not materially, but psychologically, spiritually. And of course, most religions have this theme: without pain and suffering and failure and so on, there's no spiritual growth. There's the opposite. But leftists don't understand this, and of course, their idea of well-being and growth and prosperity and so on is strictly material. And so this is the main point about the leftist psyche, the leftist mentalities, this profound desire to clutch reality through human intelligence and through human control in a way that surpasses even that in which God has failed in their view. Of course, there is no God, and there is no question for them of why nature and reality the way it is. They rarely ever ask that question, why it is the way it is. They see it as a mistake. They see every manifestation of inequality, of harm, of hurt, of pain as a mistake, and they presume themselves to be capable of correcting it. And that's why they're always obsessed with the state and with political power, because they really believe that it is possible to establish a utopia on earth. It's just that everyone that ever tried to do this, all of them leftists, most of the catastrophic movements during the 20th century were basically leftist movements and leftist ideologies, that they did it wrong and that they have it right, and if only they reach power, they will be able to bring about utopia on earth. The conservative, on the other hand, as I mentioned, is much more willing to sense, even if it's not an ideology, just this, also ideologically it exists, but temperamentally speaking, they are far more willing to accept the existence of pain and suffering and harm and all that sort of thing as a part of life, as an intrinsic part of life, and instead they emphasize the individual responsibility. You take care of yourself, you take care of your family, you take care of your psyche, and that's why they have all these behaviors that are associated with this belief, whether it is conscious or not. The emphasis on family, the emphasis on having a job and a career and something to live by, to be responsible for yourself financially. And even in the United States, for example, where you have the dilemma on weapons and the right of citizenry to carry weapons for self-protection, we find that conservatives are far more inclined for the option of citizens protecting themselves instead of relying on the state to do it for them. Opposite is prevalent among leftists, of course. Leftists have this idea that it's the state that should do everything and ensure the safety and prosperity and well-being of every last citizen. And of course the result is that that fails, because whenever you actually try to have some sort of a central superpower to control everything, it's impossible. Nobody's ever able to to control everything that way, because the variables of reality are so complex and so varied and also in constant flux that no one has yet the intelligence or the ability to control everything in this way, apart from the fact that it's impossible to control everything in the first place. It's not doable. It's not something that anyone could accomplish. So this also, of course, reflects itself in the biggest issue, which is capitalism versus socialism. Because in capitalism, it's the same emphasis on personal responsibility. If you are going to do an investment, if you have money, you have to risk investing that money in this or that project or business. And of course, what many people don't know is that the vast majority of investors and businessmen lose all the time. They still make money, but many of the vast majority of the businesses that are established end up in failure. And as an individual in society, you're responsible to find a suitable job and provide for yourself and your family and so on. Whereas on the left, it's the state that's going to sort of micromanage how these things happen. The reason the capitalist system and the free market system has survived while every other form of economic system has collapsed, usually in catastrophic ways, is because it is a pragmatic, practical, functional system. It's not that there are some oligarchs or powerful men on the top. The patriarchy are controlling everything underneath and are able to manage and engineer society into pursuing this capitalist way of life. Making money has proven to be a very successful and effective catalyst and motivator, stimulator for the human psyche. And that's the main reason this system worked, succeeded, survived. It's also highly adaptable, can change itself, adapt itself to the conditions of reality. So it's not a rigid ideological system that insists on certain configuration of economic or political relations between people and between the forces of economy. It basically leaves people be, and then the system not just functions effectively, but also evolves in time based on how people interact with each other freely. There's nothing ideological really about capitalism, and that's precisely why it has survived and continued to bring about prosperity in the world. In general, people today are far more, or let's say less poor than they once were. You compare yourself with your grandparents or even our own immediate parents, and you'll find that the ability to survive, lifespan is increasing, health is better, people live longer, they're healthier, the access to energy, access to all forms of even sources of pleasure has all increased. Of course, we are more dissatisfied than our parents, our grandparents were, but that's a different issue. That's because of the relentless ideological inculcation to which we are constantly exposed. But otherwise, it's capitalist system has brought about quite a remarkable level of continual improvement in people's lives. That's because it's not really an ideological system. It's because it is a functional, pragmatic, practical system that is capable of self-examination, self-adaptation, and that's how it survives. But whatever the causes and the forces behind this explosion of extremism among leftists, it's very interesting to see how the conservatives emerge today as some form of a natural balancing act, similar to that which we see in nature. And to extend this analogy farther, it's actually highly conceivable that that this can be reversible, that once the left is subdued, then you have to worry about conservatives and the right going too far in turn. Of course, history suggests that most extremist socialist movements have always been on the left, and that includes, of course, Nazi Germany. It was quite unique in Nazism because it involved both sort of socialist leftist extremism and also like this whole obsession with race and things of that sort that more likely to be on the right, even though we see that leftists of today are becoming also obsessed with issues of race and so on, which is it used to be something that is connected with the right extreme or far right. But anyways, history strongly suggests that the force in society that tends towards the extreme is always the left, and so we have much less reason to worry about right-wing and conservative movements going into extremes. Also, usually easier to bring right-wing extremism to the center, back to the center, to balance it with more lefty movements that will keep society and keep politics somewhere in the center. This oscillation between extremes as a fundamental sort of transcendental cosmological movement of things in nature, of natural phenomena, biological phenomena, and also of human society. It's like an archetype of function that is operating in all things that are of this world, of this existence, and that there is no way to create this dreamy state of perfect stillness that the leftists are after, the utopia on earth, the completeness, that everybody is equal, everything is equal, and nobody is suffering. This oscillation, of course, in political terms and sociopolitical terms, happen both ways. It's not just on the left, it's also on the right, but there is far more reason to worry about it in the case of the left than on the right. As I mentioned, this is a temperamental thing. It has to do with the conservative temperament. It's not one that is so hyperactive as that of the left, and this is also compounded by the fact that conservative temperaments tend to be about the individual and about taking care of oneself, of one family, and also the religious dimension that I mentioned makes conservatives less obsessed with life, basically, less obsessed with controlling and clutching life in the manner leftists are. And that's why, actually, I don't think that there will be any moment in which there will be perfection either way. If the left disappears, the right wing takes off, and if conservatives and right wing do not come to political activism, which has been the case for the past couple of decades or so, you see what happens. That's actually the situation that we are in right now. The left was allowed to take over universities and to dominate political life in the manner by which it does in the West right now, because of the absence of the right wing and because of the weakness of conservative movements and their withdrawal from public and political participation. And this is the result. And this is how it's always going to be. The only situation where sociopolitical life is relatively healthy is when you have these two opposing, or more than two. It doesn't really need to be bipolar, but it's when you have different forces in society that are more or less have equal degrees of strength, of power or influence, and that they're balancing each other. There will never be a single ideology or discourse or force in society that is capable of bringing about perfection, bringing about well-being. It's rather this diversity and sort of magnetic kind of balance that is created by having opposing forces staying at a distance from the center. And the center is most people, the average, the majority of people who naturally, I think by nature, by the grace of God, do not incline to any one extreme against another. And the reason the West is collapsing right now is that this is happening. There are so many people who are become attracted to extreme leftism, and of course we're beginning to see the withdrawal of young people from the leftist movement and leftist politics in the West right now. And this withdrawal for me represents precisely this balancing act, that once voices begin to emerge from the right or from conservatives or from rational people in general, people who are not even on any side of the political spectrum, what happens is that you begin to see that people are withdrawing from extremes and going back to the center. Most people like me who withdrew from the left didn't become conservatives or right-wingers, or become perhaps inclined to some extent in that direction, but they mostly stay in the center. This balancing effect makes people perfectly disinclined from any extremes and aware of the danger of extremes, and that's very important. And so it seems to me that this very movement of oscillation is the best that we could ever hope to accomplish by way of finding balance in society. This movement of society very much staying in the center by having different opposed forces operating on it and balancing each other thereby, I think is the best and maybe the only way through which society can remain in balance and remain in the center and does not be attracted to any one of the extremes. And history actually suggests that this is the only way, because whenever any single force dominates too much over the other or prevent other forces from existence, then you have a social catastrophe, socio-political catastrophe. And that's one of the reasons I think freedom of speech should be really respected at all times. And the fact that it's the left right now that is opposing freedom of speech and that is speaking about how certain forms of speech should be suppressed and punished and so on, that is highly alarming, because once you prevent any group of people or any social force from expressing itself for whatever reason, then that situation of imbalance begins to happen. Nothing's more important than speech, because from speech everything else issues. No form of political, genuine and substantial political participation is possible without freedom of speech. And that's why it must remain completely inviolate, completely respected. And if anybody is trying to dominate speech, then you know that extremism is coming. And it's being doing for the sake of allowing extremism to happen. That's why the fear of speech, because you know once you are in power and once you're really attempting to dominate, you know that it's speech that scares you. It's the speech of the opposing party that scares you, because you know that it can be easily effective if you want to pull society into extremes. Speech is capable from the opposing party to bring it back to the center and to bring society back to balance. Just speech is capable of doing this. This is exactly what we're seeing happening right now in the West. This withdrawal of young people from the leftist movement and politics, and at the same time the insistence on the part of the left on suppressing speech and punishing freedom of speech and restricting it and so on and so forth. This is the main idea that has been on my mind in these days, how really nearly impossible it is to bring any still state of balance. That what we call balance and stability should be seen as a movement of oscillation, of values and of culture in a manner that prevents any pole of extreme forces or opposing forces from dominating the public discourse and speech and politics and so on and so forth.